We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. My name is ChrisTiana and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. Today, we are welcoming our guest, ChrisTiana ObeySumner, Principal Social Equity Consultant and Founder. How are you doing?
Doing great. Can't complain. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to meet you and just speak with you as well. You have so many experiences. I was just commenting on, I love all of the books behind you as well. But if you could start off with telling us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and what's one of your hobbies outside of work.
Yes. So my name is ChrisTiana ObeySumner. My pronouns are they, them, and I am founder and principal consultant of Epiphanies of Equity LLC, which is a social equity consulting firm that focuses on, why humans human, and when humans are humaning with other humans, human things happen. And one of those human things that happen is often along the lines of inequity. And so looking at what is leading to that, what are upstream issues of that, and innovating and co-creating with clients and community solutions and disruptions to those inequitable systems. I think what's really hard about the hobbies is that there's so many of these things I just can't turn it off. I think it's just my life's work. Obviously, you can see I like to read books, but if I was going to do a less conspicuous one, I think I watch a lot of YouTube. I watch a lot of videos on YouTube. So yeah, sometimes it's lectures, but a lot of it might be the sort of like tea spill channels, or perhaps even like channels that are just like really stimmy, like marble runs, or putting like red hot steel balls into different substances, or like the hydraulic press channel, or Rube Goldberg machines, things like that.
Ooh, I love Rube Goldberg machines as well. I think they're so interesting and they're very captivating as well visually.
Yeah, I love to think that I have the patience, but I just remember back to the next sets, and I'm just kind of like,
No.
no.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned this is your life's work and you've dedicated, around 20 or like over 20 years to really, building out this work in social equity. And I would love to ask your why and what motivated you to really get into this space and become an expert and also help other companies who are interested in getting involved as well.
Yeah, it's definitely was not something that, to be honest, I just woke up one day and said, this is what I want to be. It was not planned. Being a consultant was not planned. And doing social equity work was not something that felt like a chosen thing. It was something that, as a Black and Indigenous and multiply disabled, non-binary person, especially coming from under-resourced backgrounds and the class analysis of all of that, it was essentially what I had to. It's sort of. At first it was a means of survival. It was being aware and learning about the different sorts of ways in which not only do I move in the world, but the ways that people understand me and expect me to move in the world, and the assumptions and biases and constructs that come out of that, especially as an autistic Black person born in the 80s, right at the advent of the ADA. And we know now that there's still spaces to be with the ADA. But my original career was to become a psychologist. And so a lot of this work came out of about 10 years pursuing that dream in my former life, as well as working in direct social service, mostly in housing justice and disability justice, and often in relationship between nonprofits and public administration, especially around grant funding. And what I saw in that career, and not just with the education, but also with the direct experience, is the extent to which there are either these human barriers, these socio-cultural barriers, while we also live in a society where socially, culturally, and politically, it just is not seen as a strength or a positive to negotiate and navigate relationship-based conflict. But I also saw the extent to which these larger systems and constructs, all of these things are happening in the unconscious, in the implicit, in the squishy, are those pieces that are really coming out into these sort of inequities. And so my contribution to this is to really to get down to the taproot. They always talk about structures of oppression. They say, sometimes I feel like people are just knocking out a wall in their kitchen of the structures of oppression. Sure, the floor plan is a lot more open, but that's not really addressing the standing structure. And I even say it's not enough to knock down those structures and fortify foundations if you're not going to do a full environmental review to get down to the water table, to the mycelium, to the taproot of where these inequities are coming from. And that might require you needing to reason backwards, looking at upstream issues and impetus and origins to what is happening to you in this moment, and start to vision what it looks like downstream. And when I mean an equity work downstream, that's three, maybe 7 generations down. So, I came into it because I really do. I think, to wrap up, I think what's really important for me is to be able to continue to survive and thrive. And being a birthing person in a space of considering family planning, I think there's a part of this that now has a whole different aspect, especially with an aging parent, knowing sort of what the statistics and the data are on that, just foundation, let alone sort of the themes and the narratives and the stories that we know as how this is coming out in our society.
Absolutely. And I definitely appreciate you sharing your personal experience. And it sounds like you are really deeply passionate about this work to not only, like you said, build systems that are, have survived, but also thrive as well for others, which I think is really important too. And just have these hard conversations and just make sure to lean into it and fully immerse yourself in this kind of work, which definitely makes sense. One of the kind of things that you mentioned also is just the ways in which that you identify personally. And we know that, there are multiple ways that others do intersect their identity as well. And we know that Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in the 80s when she was talking specifically about Black women. But I would love to ask kind of your opinion around what does intersectionality have to do with social equity, and how that definition really resonates with the work as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think that intersectionality has, for lack of a less strong term, been co-opted. It is not really the original intention for it, and the original intention for intersectionality makes it really inextricable from social equity. So the original intent of intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a legal scholar, as you said, in the 80s, was navigating and exploring a sort of an outcry by Black women trying to find work, especially in the manufacturing automobile sort of industry. And when she went to one of the organizations, they said, well, we hire Black folks and we hire women. So I don't know what they're talking about. There must be something in their applications. And they did hire Black folks. They hired primarily Black men for back of the house assembly line work. And they did hire women. They hired primarily white women for front of house administrative client facing work. And it is at that tangle, at that crossroad, in that intersection, that the Black women faced both misogyny or sexism and racism or anti-Blackness, coming into a compounding impact of that. It's not to say that intersectionality is only for misogynoir or NOIR at the end, or the experience of misogyny at the intersection of anti-Blackness. But it is saying that we need to get a little bit closer to this original origin of what intersectionality means, which is two or more, the way I define it would be two or more compounding in the identities or communities or lived experiences that are historically or systemically marginalized, exploited, or oppressed. Absolutely. What has happened today is that intersectionality has came to mean two or more experiences as it interacts in your life. So if those are two or more experiences that say may be privileged in sort of how it moves through the world and the extent to which it has to think about that part of the lived experience moving through the world, that might still be an aspect of this. But I would argue that would be more of your social identity profile, or your narrative understanding, or your narrative identity, or your critical consciousness and how you move into space, than it would be intersectionality. The final thing I'll say about intersectionality is really important, especially in the work I do in disability justice, of which intersectionality is the first principle, is that people see intersectionality as sort of a sum of its parts. So if I say I'm Black and disabled, people will say, okay, well, there's Blackness over here in this red portion, and disabled over here in this blue portion. And what I would argue is that it is purple. The circle is purple. It's not that the pie chart is half red and half blue. So what's important about that, especially when we think about intersectionality and centering intersectionality in its original intent, is like, say, in my example again, as a Black disabled person, I have experiences of racism or anti-Blackness, and I share those experiences of racism or anti-Blackness with other Black, Brown, Indigenous folks. And I have experiences of ableism, and I share those experiences of ableism with other disabled folks or folks who have a disability. And then there's this tertiary piece that I have this experience of being a Black, Indigenous, disabled person. And in itself is its own set of expectations and assumptions and history and biases and systemic oppression and marginalization. And it's important that we hold in intersectionality the full constellation of who someone is, instead of sort of seeing someone in sort of one sort of light, seeing the person simply as a prism of which you're through this one face that you're looking in this prism, you're seeing that one portion of that person's spectrum of light, but not the full spectrum, and being able to really hold the bigness of that.
Absolutely. And I definitely appreciate your point of going back to the original intent of, what Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about in her study for intersectionality, and also words definitely matter, and having that foundation of just what are you talking about when you're talking about identity, and who you're trying to include in the conversation, having an understanding of there are different overlapping identities that folks need to be aware of as well, that create this entirely different experience than what one might assume. Another thing that you mentioned was unconscious bias in your line of work as well. How do you see like unconscious bias really showing up in the workplace today?
I think that the biggest misnomer about unconscious bias is that it's a thing that happens sometimes and that it's a thing that's bad. But I think the reframe of that is that it's something that happens all the time and it's a human thing. So humans have this tendency to need to have clarity, to need to make meaning, to have affinity to certain things based on how familiar it feels to them. And all of these are ways that bias comes up. What's also important about unconscious bias is that it's unconscious. It is not going to be the things that you're going to be sitting and saying, okay, today, emails, coffee, bias. Like that's not going to be there. And if we are doing that, we're talking about conscious bias, we're talking explicit bias, we're talking explicit harm. But I'm talking about those pieces that come up for you in your automatic brain. If you think about where your unconscious comes from, and I wish like I could have a whole podcast talking about the brain, because this is also, like I said, psychology background, this is sort of where I get excited. But the midbrain is that part of your brain. In a lot of ways, the unconscious bias comes from. The midbrain or the limbic system is where your amygdala is. Your amygdala is what sort of scans your environment or social cues for any action responses or hypervigilant responses or even anxiety or trauma responses. Your hippocampus, which is in here, is the part of your brain that sort of has your emotional memory. You've experienced it before, if it's an intergenerational narrative or trauma. If it's epigenetic, which means that there's survival or action responses or hypervigilant responses passed down in your genes. Some of the research says up to 14 generations. So if a generation is about 20 years, we're talking 280 years. So that's where sort of that Renesmee McKean, the book My Grandmother's Hands, or Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy comes into some of those epigenetics. But what's important to say to an unconscious bias, it's happening all the time. It's happening all the time. And there's over 150 types of unconscious bias. It's also not it's not necessarily an abstract thing, but there is a pathway, a concerted pathway with your limbic system, how you think, to what extent you are reflecting and mindful and aware of sort of those somatic responses that come up in your body. If you've done some time interrogating yourself around some of those biases and surfacing some of those in the moment, or even in reflection afterward, all of those are going to have an impact to the extent to which folks are aware of those coming up. What's really, really important to do is to start to reflect on your day to see if there's any of those pieces are coming up, and just to see what those unconscious biases may be. If you're being a conscious bias, I think that there's a conversation to be had about sort of, is that within your moral ethics and principles to believe that bias, and really starting to sort of listen to other narratives or other perspectives and really grapple with it. I'm not saying that you're going to go and listen or read a book and you're going to agree with it, but interact with it. Have a discourse with it. Really sit with it and sort of see, like, how does this impact me? What does this look like in my body mind? Unconscious bias, though, I would say is if I could be fair and say Vegas odds based on what I've read, it's anywhere from 75 to 85% of our everyday. That is a part of you that comes out when you are at 4:30 and you're on your sixth Zoom meeting and you haven't eaten and your coffee's whirring, you have to pee and the dog has your bra in the background when you're on a Zoom call and you have a 5:30 deadline and something falls in your lap. In that moment, no matter how many unconscious bias trainings you have, it's not impossible but improbable that you're going to say, I think that this is one of those characteristics of the racial equity framework I just learned about. And I remember that this was I'm supposed to use to have to nurture conflict. And this is what you're not going to do that. You're not. Don't do that. I'm telling you, you can work towards that. But what is most important is to continue to have that dialogue with yourself, and to know thyself beyond sort of that conscious piece. One fun activity that can help get you started is to think about where your socialization and conditioning came from, and how some of these constructs like gender or professionalism or beauty or even altruism comes out from your background, from your socialization and conditioning, from the societies and communities that you come from. So a fun thing to do if you haven't done it recently is to think about a cartoon or a show that you used to run home from school during your school days. You used to run home and then watch it as an adult. And I want you to name all of the pieces in there that might have implicit messaging or conditioning or socialization that might have been sort of part of that automatic brain that sort of came out. I just did this with SpongeBob and I was just very, very.
That's definitely a good exercise to have, and also just a re-examining of the norms and the kind of words of, like, especially professionalism over this past year with the pandemic and Zoom backgrounds. And you mentioned, the example of just like everything happening in your house at the same time. And I was just having a conversation with someone else as well of just like the definition of quote unquote normal for me is different than normal than my colleagues, and normal for everyone based on our circumstances and the experiences we're bringing into work as well. So I think that's definitely important too. I was also going to ask as well, you noted, the very specific differences between unconscious bias and conscious bias. If someone does take an inventory and reflect at the end of the day to recognize where those moments of unconscious bias like were, and they want to be, better in the future, they want to be active allies, or what folks like to call accomplices. How do you think about really, meaningfully showing up for someone and being an ally?
There's a lot of information out there that may say certain things. I will say the number one thing that's needed to be an ally or accomplice or in solidarity or whatever you call that is, while you're trying to save the world, find those ways in which you need to save the world from yourself. And that's going to mean disrupting yourself. And it's going to mean taking that time to have a critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is a term by Paulo Freire that essentially means that not only are you aware of self, but you're aware of how you show up and have impact in space with others. So this is also going to be important to note about what power dynamics do you hold. Is there a way that you show up in space where you may or may not be held based on sort of the way that your communication style or your speech? Or there may even be some of those pieces where just by nature of being in space, there might be some surfacing of tensions that just by your nature of being there might happen. And I will say that if you are hearing that last one, depending on your social identity profile or your intersectionality, it's either going to resonate with you or you're going to be like, well, what do you mean that the way that I show up might surface tension for other people just by showing up? Well, a lot of folks, especially when we talk about those more visible diversity points, the pieces of you that sort of you wear out loud, or how my spouse says, that walks in the room before you do. Those are the pieces that really, I think, is important for critical consciousness. And folks who are oppressed, marginalized, or exploited and have identities around that historically or systemically sort of move in a way where, well, for most part, move in a way where they are consistently conscious of that. You know, we talk a lot about recently about the natural hair discrimination bills that have been going out, the Crown Act. And even in that space, have been, you know, I know historically, Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, especially if they have kinky, coily hair, was expected in order to be professional to have smooth, straight hair. And even at the Supreme Court level of the United States, they have argued this to be incorporated into civil rights law, and it has consistently been not passed because they don't see it as an immutable characteristic. Meaning you can change it. It's not something that they feel is an inherent protected characteristic of race or ethnicity. However, the immutable characteristic of it usually has meant harm to the person who has to smooth their hair. Everything from lye and chemical relaxers to keratin treatments that give off formaldehyde as a smoke as part of its smoke point when it's being activated in your hair, and the chemical burns that continue with most smoothing treatments that folks have. So it is important, even down to chronic alopecia in the front of the head for folks with kinky coily hair who use weaves or wigs or braids to sort of also have those professional hairstyles. So there is literal impacts to this. And in those moments, there are definitely some of those pieces that, you know, the people are go, what could have been done? And I think it's important to have an impact over intent mindset with this. It's important to address the disparity area and bring parity to that. But really what could have been really helpful throughout all of this time is for folks to see those ways in which they needed to disrupt themselves. And in this case, the unconscious bias or construct of professionalism equaling someone with smooth, non-kinky, coily hair that was then provided liberation from having to go through those measures. So I would say there is a lot of different sort of things that you can do to be an ally or an accomplice. It really does come down to following calls of action, amplifying leadership and voices of those most impacted, and doing that active, lifelong, ongoing self-audit and reflection work to ensure that you are not bringing in some of those pieces of those systems of repression coming off of your body mind. I guess the last thing I'll say to this is that we talk a lot about, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. and social equity and nonviolence. The thing that's really important about the nonviolence is that it's not that nonviolence is anything about being passive or stoic. It also is about taking active responsibility, even as a harmed person. The 4 steps of nonviolent direct action that Martin Luther King outlined in his letter to Birmingham jail is first, information gathering, second, negotiation, third, self-purification, fourth, direct action. And it's that self-purification that's really important, because as people were preparing for the direct action, there was a self-purification where they were preparing not just for the actual physical action of it. So say if they're going to go to a soda counter, they might practice what it feels like to be pushed back from the soda counter so that, you know, if someone does try to jerk them off the seat, they already have a feeling of what that is in their body. But also doing a self-reflection interrogation of self around what are some of those pieces, some of those systems of repression that still reside within my body mind. I really need to surface and check before we go into the direct action so that I can be mindful of it and it doesn't impede our progress. And I think being in that sort of space of doing that is going to be not only something that I think is extremely helpful, but also something that I very, very rarely see folks doing.
Absolutely. And I think the internal work, especially when you are on a team, when you are making these decisions, definitely manifests in that external, how you kind of move throughout the world and just like think about these choices that you definitely have. So I think that's a really important foundation to really think about when you are approaching this work. And one of the things that I also wanted to ask you about as well is your experience leading the Seattle Opera's racial equity work, and just like the kind of how you thought about the strategy there. And also, I know in conversations with a lot of people, talking about the ROI of something that's really kind of somewhat intangible, of just measuring the equity of a workplace or an initiative. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and they kind of loop into each other. So Seattle Opera is when I get asked about that, it's always really fun because it was actually one of the first accounts I had. I now am up to almost 150 clients across the last 4 years. So it's always great to reflect back on the Seattle Opera, but it also comes back to that measuring equity. So all the way back in the way back when I first sort of hung my shingle, I was able to work with the Seattle Opera or just around sort of the tensions of performing pieces on stage that also have the sort of tension and sort of where it came from, the origin story, perhaps even the librettist or the person who wrote the opera, and who ends up on stage to represent that. It had came after some folks had reached out, and I'm only sharing things or like you can Google because I know I'm not supposed to share, but you can Google it and it's fair game. It came out of a conversation in some sort of focus groups around a production of Madame Butterfly, which is a very highly contentious opera, as well as the sometimes based on a lot of different factors, but especially union, sort of like first in time seniority sort of things, as well as sort of the casting process that they had.
Right.
Butterfly, who was Japanese, would sometimes be played by folks who are not Japanese or even Asian at all. And so that led down sort of this pathway where they were putting on AIDA. And AIDA is set between Egypt and Ethiopia. That's right. Yes. Between Egypt and Ethiopia in conflict with each other. And at that time, they had at least a half, maybe 3/4 of their cast was white. And, we were having conversations around, like, do we have to keep it in Africa? Since, everyone is white, and there's definitely been some of those creative sort of changes for equity. However, they made a sort of decision. So it came to this conversation around, well, what does AIDA mean to the Black community? I was in a meeting with our client, and I was like, I can't tell you that. Yeah, I can give you some suggestions or best practices or sort of perhaps some themes across the narratives. But if you really want to know the answer to that question and how to truly make this a situation, address the impacts of the situation, you got to ask the community.
Yeah.
And so that's what led to a town hall, mostly of Black, Brown, Indigenous, mostly arts leaders, but there was some community members in that meeting where they gave these perspectives, and they were saying things like, Black community don't care about AIDA because when was it ever ours? And later in that season was Porgy and Bess, which then goes back to sort of the Gershwin estate, going and spending 3 months, I think, of it living with the Gullah Geechee folks in the Mid-Atlantic, and then coming and writing this whole opera based on his observations. But yet the Gershwin estate, they were like, oh, well, they require us to have a full Black cast, so we had to do that. But then it was sort of like, then what is sort of the barrier or bottleneck for you doing that with AIDA without being forced to do it? And I think that gets to your question about equity and ROI. This, I think that there's a piece of this where, going back to the unconscious bias, I think there is a bias where we feel like, we know there's certain things that we have to do, but I think sometimes we wait until we're given a command to do it. And what's unfortunate about that is that there's that the equity is about proactive and preemptive strategies for disrupting or eliminating harm, or at least having a harm reductive approach. So when we are reactively waiting for those pieces and those prompts to start equity, we're already behind.
Yeah.
I think equity can be, if when in doubt, you can understand equity to mean bringing parity to areas of disparity. You see a disparity area, let's address it, let's strategize around it, and ensure that we are, again, centering the voices and leadership of those most intersectionally impacted in the strategy and the solution building. The return on investment really is based on that impact over intent. A fun story happened where I was sort of dancing in my living room with my friend, and we were sort of going out. We all had gotten back. So it's great. And so in the middle of us dancing, this sort of like wild animals, they accidentally socked me in the jaw. Totally cool. And at that moment, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. They got the peas out of the freezer to put it on my face. And we're like, okay, we're going to keep dancing to make sure we're a little bit further apart. We don't do as much industrial punching or anything like that. But at the end of the day, even though that wasn't their intention to sock me in the jaw, I still got punched. Yeah. And it's that that's really important about the impact over intent. We could start to spin our wheels and get stuck in, I didn't mean that. It's not my heart. I want to defend myself. I feel like you're trying to story me as this or this person. And really, that is important. I think it's important for our self-reflection. I think it's important to sort of navigate the extent to which we have trust and rapport in our relationships and the strength of our relationships, be able to hold the fallibility of humans, because the error is human. We're not going to be perfect in equity.
Absolutely.
But I think what's really important is that there's a disparity area there. Mm-hmm. And it's important for you to bring parity to it, to bring parity to areas of disparity. And I think your ROI is if that impacted community is coming to you and they're saying, we're feeling it. Not that you're doing it, we're feeling the parity. That's when you start to have that return on investment. And I think that's what's also important about centering leadership in the voices of those most impacted. It's one thing to build knowledge. Anyone could build knowledge about something, but that wisdom comes from knowing how that knowledge has a practical implication in an embodied experience. And it's going to be really, really difficult as a witness, an ally, an accomplice, or in solidarity to ever truly understand what it means to have that embodied experience. But understanding what it means to be an embodied experience is absolutely not a prerequisite for bringing parity to disparity.
I love that, bringing parity to areas of disparity. I'm going to take that knowledge with me and pass it along in just the spaces that I am in as well. I think that is really important for folks to know. And again, what you said, it's not a prerequisite to because no one will ever understand the lived experiences of somebody else. And to your point earlier too, when they were asking you, how does the Black community feel about this? It's just like communities are not a monolith either. And that is also something that needs to be recognized. You need to listen and bring people together and honestly have that two-way conversation as well. You mentioned you have over 150 clients and you've been doing this work for a long time. So I know you probably have many of these, but what is another kind of proudest moment for you in this social equity work?
Oh, I think one of the proudest moments in this work that I've done, there's so many.
There are so many.
I think the reason why it's hard is because, I loathe to bring up Drake, even though they're a guilty pleasure, but they have this song called Trophies. And the chorus is what's coming up in my head. But I think the proudest moment that I have had in terms of this work, to be completely honest, is in the last 4 years, going up to that number. This is like the first year that I really started putting out things like advertisements. I still haven't. Everything up to this point has been word of mouth. It's gotten to a place too where I could start bringing on contractors, which I had been doing this work on my own for so long. And I think as I start to, as part of that work, ask for feedback and some of those things, I think this extent to which folks resonate with this work and that work continues to self-sustain itself through organic growth to this point, I think is a proud moment for me, because Epiphanies of Equity, that is the name is also my goal. I want folks to get to that place where they're like, oh. And I think it's from that space of awareness that we could start to build space. And so I think that every day that I am able to come to this computer and take what was a life of both direct impact, witnessing through social services, um, and innovating and continuing to look for these solutions, and read all these books and come up with these frameworks based on this work that's sort of evolving, and it continues to resonate. I feel like I have a new proud moment every day.
Absolutely. And that's really a testament to the work that you do just in the community, and just the name of your body of work too, for that organic growth as well. So I think that is an amazing proudest moment out of all of them as well. And then I know that we have talked about a lot of different topics here today, and I really appreciate your insights around social equity. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the folks that are listening that we haven't covered as well?
Two things. Number one, don't give up, because you will make mistakes. It's important to both learn from mistakes and successes, and to actively reflect on that. But two, do the thing. Just do the thing. When you learn something, put it into practice. The three biggest things that humans hate are the three biggest things we need for equity work, which is risk, discomfort, and change. We dislike discomfort. Almost all mammals with limbic systems hate discomfort. We have to lean into discomfort because it's an uncomfortable conversation. And those who are directly impacted by this can tell you the extent to which it's uncomfortable constantly. So to be in solidarity, or to be an accomplice or ally, is to have the level of empathy that you are feeling at least uncomfortable to, if not more so. We hate change, even if you win the lottery. That's why people's life explodes. We hate change. But we're going to have to change, because it's obvious that the system we have in place right now is not working.
Right.
And it's going to be a risk, because the system that we have in place is not working. So everything that we do to bring parity to areas of disparity, in spite of that, is going to be a risk to us. And so sometimes I have clients who are like, well, we want to be an anti-racist organization. Cool. Okay, we're going to do these things. Oh, but we do these things. We might not be asked to be on this task force anymore. We might lose this client. We might lose this grant funding. Like, how, what are we supposed to do? Like, are we just going to lose these things? Maybe. Because what it might mean is that those things are rooted in inequities that are perpetuating or upholding systems of oppression. If you can't find a way to strategize through it, it might need to be a risk that you take in order to be in integrity with your values, morals, and ethics for your organization as well as for yourself. So lean into this comfort, change, and risk, and also learn from those mistakes. If you're interested in getting in touch with me, you can find me either at ChrisTianaObeySumner.com, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Linktree. I'm sort of in a lot of different spaces. Also, I was told, and I just found out like a week or so ago, that I have things on the internet. So there's some content and some trainings and things like that I've done in the past, especially on YouTube, if you were to Google my name. But also going to www.epiphaniesofequity.com or www.ChrisTianaObeySumner.com will get you to the landing page of our organization if you are interested in continuing this conversation through coaching, training, consulting, or not your average book clubs or anything like that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, ChrisTiana, for being a guest on Reimagining Company Culture. There are so many insights that I was copiously taking notes as well. So I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you to all of our listeners who are listening to this episode right now. As a reminder, at AllVoices, we believe in the power of employees to speak up and believe it's a requirement for everybody to succeed at the organization. And we will talk soon.